Okay, so I was telling you guys about the Red Scare. Red Scare is a manifestation of the reactionary side of the 1920s. It was America's first significant brush with anti-communist hysteria, born of a number of interesting things. Oh, I was telling you that the Americans had kind of revved themselves and are ready to go, revved up for the support of the war, when all of a sudden the war kind of abruptly came to an end, and it's like the Americans had all this kind of built up angst. And this is a dumb little story, but I mean, I feel like I understand this just a little bit. I played football for RCC, and we came down to play Palomar College one Saturday, and we went through the entire pregame. You know, pregame, you're on the field, you're all warmed up and everything. Went back in the locker room. Well, when we came back out onto the field, fog had enveloped everything. It was in this. We played at Vista High School, and the fog had come in essentially, and the fog was so thick that you couldn't see across the football field. It was just kind of an amazing little moment there. And I remember, we're standing on our sideline, but I can't even see the other team. They're over there somewhere, of course, and I was thinking to myself, if we tried to play this, how would this work out? The guys would kick off, and the ball would go into the fog, and of course the team that was receiving the ball would have to find it, of course, and maybe hear it. And I thought if you found the ball, you kind of quietly sneak up your sideline, is keeping out of the fog and keeping so no one could really see you. Anyway, you couldn't see, and so they called the game, and I just remember how weird it was, to prepare yourself for a football game, to amp yourself up, and then to have no game that would take place. And I swear it went from being, that weird to all kinds of other weird. We went back into the locker room, we showered to go home, we came back out, it was clear, of course, this is about 30 minutes later. We all tried to get on our buses. One of the buses broke down, so the whole team had to load onto one bus, and as we're driving on the 78 heading back towards Escondido to go north to Riverside, I was sitting at the window and I'm looking, and I see there's a outdoor theater, drive-in theater, and there was a sex scene on the screen, and I just said to my buddy next to me, I said, "Hey, look, there's a sex scene." And when I said that, the entire team rushed over to this side of the, and the bus was jerking over like this, and the bus driver was screaming at us to sit down. And just a really interesting night, what can I say? But one thing that seemed to motivate the Red Scare was the fact that Americans had got all amped up for war, and then, the war was over, and there wasn't much they could do about that. Also associated with this was the fact that there was an economic recession. It's a common phenomenon. After the war is over, the economy begins to shut down a little bit, of course, or slow down in dramatic fashion. People were kind of all anxious about that particular situation. There were lots of immigrants in America. Clearly, the kind of massiveness of immigration and the anti-foreign feelings in America were kind of primed at that moment. So that seems to be motivating factors. There had been a communist revolution. I mean, that was a reality in Russia. And, it's hard to remember exactly how that would work out. But when the Russian Revolution occurred, it kind of sent a shockwave across the entire world. So, maybe Marx was right. Maybe communism is really going to happen in this big kind of way. And there were these moments all across the globe, kind of communist uprising. In Italy, it's called the Epoca Rosa, the Red Epic, when all of a sudden the communists kind of rise up. In Germany, it was called the Spartacus movement of all these German communists. And you see similar activities in France and Spain and in England too. So, and then in 1919 there was the formation of the American Communist Party that began to form itself. I want you to know the American Communist Party has always been pathetic. It's been so difficult, of course, to really galvanize any American support for communism in one way or the other. But all this was fearful in the minds of many Americans. Oh my God, So one more thing to add, kind of to the powder keg. And then the final killer component that really kicked off the Red Scare, there were a series of bombings that took place. And these were these kind of anarchist bombings. They're just individual crazy people doing this stuff. And there were these letter bombs that were sent to prominent political people with some casualty resulting from that. The most famous of all the bombs was a little package bomb. And the bomb was sent to the Attorney General of the United States of America. And there were two guys, and they apparently were carrying the bomb across the package bomb across the yard and put it on the porch when the bomb went off. And the Attorney General came out that day just to find, pink mist all over the place. These guys had blown themselves to smithereens. But the bombings were disconcerting, to say the least. And it was, when they finally investigated, it was just totally idiosyncratic, crazy dudes doing these kind of bombings. But everything together kind of put, this strange feeling of the nation became sort of fearful at that moment. Now, in this kind of moment, what you need is someone in a position of authority to step forward and, calm everybody down. But Woodrow Wilson had suffered his stroke. He was totally out of action. He couldn't do anything about it. And so instead of, Wilson maybe calming everyone, you had another politician who stepped forward to kind of fan the flames. His name was A. Mitchell Palmer, and he was the Democratic Attorney General. He was the Attorney General for the United States of America under the Wilson administration. And Palmer was trying to make a name for himself. He was planning a run for the presidency. So he decided to play upon the fears of Americans by kind of, instead of playing down these idiosyncratic situations that really meant nothing really seriously, and rather playing them up, generating a notion that there might be a communist threat, And what he did was he said, okay, there could be a communist threat, but don't worry, folks, I'm going to deal with it. He wanted to make himself look like the hero of this particular moment. And so by doing this, he really scared people. This is a person in a position of authority, kind of, causing a tremendous amount of fear. Dumb story, but when my Patty and I were at Santa Barbara, we lived in Francisco Torres, which is a high-rise dorm that's just off campus. And one night, there was kind of a scary incident, and the RA asked us all to come into the central meeting area on our floor, and he told us that the train had wrecked not too far from us, and that some of the train cars had spilled, and they were worried that could be a toxic situation that we needed to evacuate. But the way he did it, he said, "You are in danger. You need to get out of here." And when he said that, everyone just freaked, and girls were screaming and people running down the hallway. I remember I just took Patty and I just kind of pulled her back against the wall to let the rush of people, the stampede, go, and we'd go afterwards. And we did go to the evacuation site, but and it turned out to be it was a carload of molasses that had spilled, and so it may have had an interesting odor, but it wasn't in the least bit dangerous. But that person in authority scared the crap out of it. A person in authority needs to be the person who's kind of trying to calm the situation. And Mitchell Palmer did the exact opposite. He kind of exacerbated the situation. Now, he wanted to make good on his promise, so he ordered a roundup of all the communists. He calls for a dragnet to be issued out there. The agents of the federal government and the Department of Justice are supposed to round up all the radicals, the commies. And so he sends his men out in the field, and of course they're calling back relatively quickly, and they say, we can't find any communists. And so Palmer just told them, well, round up radical-looking people, And of course that meant the guys with big hair and big beards start getting arrested like it's going out of style. They ultimately did arrest around 10,000 individuals. And there's issues of habeas corpus, and every single one of them was basically released. I mean, they were arrested for looking strange or something like that. I mean, and many of them were immigrants. That became part of the story. But 10,000 arrests and absolutely no convictions. The one kind of really bad thing for those that were rounded up, where there were about 500 Russian emigres, and the 500 Russian emigres were sent back to Russia. And these are guys probably trying to flee the communist regime, and who knows what happened to them when they were sent back to Russia. But A. Mitchell Palmer kind of, he, instead of putting a lid on the controversy or the problem, he kind of fanned the flames, and of course it ended up being a full-scale national panic. Now, when you do stuff like this, of course, bad things can happen. And so, besides what happened to all these individuals who were simply rounded up and arrested for no good reason, it didn't take long for the kind of panic feeling associated with the Red Scare to manifest as race riots. So what began as an anti-communist dynamic turned into increasing an anti-black dynamic. And we see very significant race riots and deadly race riots breaking out in Chicago. Chicago was the first, one of those just tragic little moments where, on the beach there on a hot day, there was like the invisible line that separated the area where the black people would be from where the white people would be. And this little black boy just incidentally drifted across the line. He's just playing out there, in the water. And all of a sudden some white people see him and they stoned him. They threw rocks at him. And it just generated an explosion of animosity between whites. And this was a true race riot where white people and black people are going after each other. And it got even more virulent in East St. Louis. This is across the river in Illinois from St. Louis. Just this explosive race riot. So one really tragic outcome of the Red Scare were the race riots that accompanied it. The other kind of enduring tragedy of the race riot, of the Red Scare, was that it brought to the fore a problematic figure in American governmental history. Now, I don't know exactly why he did this, but he took the same construct as A. Mitchell Palmer. So look at A. Mitchell Palmer's name. He starts with initial, and he has a middle name, and then his last name. And this individual who became very famous in America will do the same thing. I don't know if you can guess what I'm about to say about this, but this is the moment of the rise of J. Edgar Hoover. And J. Edgar Hoover, by almost all objective analysis, is a really problematic figure in American history. He was the head of the anti-radical division at the Department of Justice. And what happened was that in this moment of an apparent need, of course, to round up radicals, he was empowered in a significant way. And later this would evolve to become the Bureau of Investigation and ultimately the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or the FBI. J. Edgar Hoover is the original head of the FBI. And he will establish kind of a reign, I'm not going to say a reign of terror, but a dictatorship over this agency. And the reality is that they won't get rid of this guy until he dies. He's going to be in charge of the FBI well into the 1970s. So a 50-plus year career as the chief law enforcement officer of the United States. Now, the reason that he's problematic, it's not that he's the head of the FBI, but he's just the person he was. And, here's one thing that's interesting about him. He was a homosexual, closet homosexual. Nothing wrong with that at all. He was a cross-dresser. And, there are people that had saw J. Edgar Hoover dressed in nylons and high heels and stuff like that. And, I don't criticize that at all. In fact, there were times when I liked to cross-dress too. What can I say? It's kind of fun. And nothing wrong with that, but he forced the FBI to be this straight white men. He wouldn't allow anyone who deviated from the norm at all, and yet he was in his own kind of interesting deviation through his own behaviors. He was an inveterate gambler who racked up significant debts, and we do believe that his gambling activities ultimately created at least knowledge and connections to some degree with organized crime. And yet he never seemed to be willing to admit that there was organized crime in America. Here is the chief law enforcement officer in America, and he's standing before Congress, and the congressman is asking him, Mr. Hoover, isn't it true that there is an organized mob and the Cosa Nostra in America? And Hoover would say, no, there is no significant evidence. It's absolutely a lie, essentially. And there are stories that when agents got too close to taking down the mob, J. Edgar Hoover would kind of shut them down. He didn't want that too. And probably worst of all, he simply maintained this position of power, primarily by knowing everything about everyone and having information, of course, that could do them damage. So he kept files on everybody, and he wanted to know exactly what that person was doing, and if they did anything wrong, he wanted to know about it, of course, so he could use that to his advantage. And one of the people that he really kept close tabs on was John F. Kennedy. He didn't like Kennedy, and he kept close tabs on Kennedy, and he was very aware that Kennedy, was having affairs and doing things like that. So, it's like he didn't want anyone to mess with him. So, he had more information on them than they had themselves. And just a couple other things. He despised Martin Luther King, was just harassed Martin Luther King endlessly, essentially, just endlessly watching him and hated him. He hated John Lennon, and he harassed John Lennon and kept spies on John Lennon all the time. So the Beatle, John Lennon. So this guy just had his own kind of personal agenda. And the reality is, that he's a power, and they don't get rid of him until he dies, basically. And I have to tell you, there are many people in the FBI that think we shouldn't call their headquarters the Hoover Building, because Hoover, in some ways, is a very problematic, disreputable individual. And forgive me, I'm going to crunch that one, okay? Because I don't really think he was a good person as far as America was concerned. So one enduring result, negative result of the Red Scare was the appearance, the rise to power of J. Edgar Hoover. A second really interesting and problematic manifestation of reaction in the 1920s. Remember that I told you reaction is this kind of uncontrollable, instinctual reaction, and oftentimes it doesn't make any kind of sense, but still, we see it manifesting. And one of the very powerful incidents of the 1920s is something called the Sacco and Vanzetti case, or the situation of Sacco and Vanzetti. This involves two Italian immigrants. It was Niccolo Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. These are not identifications. I'm just, want to give you guys some information on this particular story. But these were two Italian immigrants that got caught up in kind of a legal situation, in a crime, which most people think that they weren't even involved in. So the story is this. I can't think it was April, but in 1920 there was a vicious murder that took place in Braintree, Massachusetts, not far outside of Boston. It was at a shoe factory, and there was a big factory campus, and the factory building was over here, and the headquarters, the corporate offices were over here. And it was a Friday afternoon, and the paymaster and his assistant were going to take the money from the main office there, all walking over to the factory to pay the guys as they left. And in those days, they actually paid the workers in cash. So they're walking with a couple big satchels of money. And usually they would drive, even though it wasn't much different, they would drive, but this time they decided to walk. As they're walking across, and it's quite a distance between the two buildings, a black car drives up, 4 men jump out, they gun down the paymaster and his assistant, they steal the money, and they drive away. And this is seen from a distance, but no close observation. So nobody could actually see who was doing this, right? Now the police had no particular lead, so they're trying to figure out what's going on. And they have a person of interest, and his name was Mike Boda. And they knew that Mike Boda had a motorcycle that was in a repair shop in Boston. So they told the mechanic that when Mike Boda comes in, they want to talk to him. So Mike Boda comes in with a friend, and they're going to pick up the motorcycle. And the mechanic calls the cops. He says, "That dude you're interested, he's here." And so, the guy's kind of, he's delaying, and Mike Boda and his buddy, they get suspicious, so they kind of take off, and they're never going to be seen for again. But they're soon after, 2 of their friends come, and the friends were Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. And they're sitting there waiting, and they realize something's weird, so they walk away too, and they just simply walk down to the local trolley stop, and they waited for the trolley. But before they could leave, the cops get there, and the cops arrest them, and they're going to charge them, try them, convict them, and execute them for the murder of the paymaster and his assistant. Now, as the trial progresses, it becomes increasingly clear that there is no significant evidence linking these 2 men to the crime. They both had alibis of greater or lesser strength. But what you really see is that there's no ballistic evidence, I should tell you that part of it. But what the big thing was, when you listen to the prosecution is focusing not on the crime, but on the fact that they were Italians, that they didn't speak English, that they had been socialist in Italy, that they had run away from, Italy, that they didn't serve in World War I. And you can imagine, if you're an Italian immigrant, the last thing you want to go do is go back and fight in World War I. That they were armed. They actually were both carrying weapons, but it wasn't uncommon for people to carry weapons. It's a little more common than, actually it's very common today too, I guess I should say. Anyway, and they had lied to the cops. They said they didn't know Mike Boda. That's true. They did know Mike Boda. But none of that is evidence in a murder trial. They're being accused of being radicals and immigrants. And yet, even though the evidence was super flimsy, the jury found them guilty. The judge clearly was against them from the very beginning. And the 2 of them, Niccolo Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, are sentenced to death. Now, it's a fairly long process of getting to the actual execution. The crime was in 1920, and the execution didn't take place until 1927. And during that time, there's evidence kind of building that there was improprieties in the case itself. The American Bar Association made a formal protest against it, that the trial had not been the right way it could be. As they got closer to the execution, massive protests broke out, not just in America, but foreign protests in Rome and Sao Paulo, Brazil, where other Italians, protesting the injustice of this all. And on the actual night of the execution, 10,000 Americans, 10,000 protesters held a vigil protest outside the prison. And yet, it didn't matter. The 2 of them were both executed for a crime that almost everyone thinks they didn't commit. So the question is, what's going on here? And the best we can argue is that this is simply a powerful anti-immigrant expression. That Americans, are simply fed up with all the immigrants that are coming. And if a couple of them had to be inappropriately martyred for the cause, well, it doesn't matter. It's just, this is the Americans expressing their animosity towards immigration, which was a powerful reactionary expression of the 1920s. And I want you to know, it wasn't just, Sacco and Vanzetti's kind of tragedy. They began to move in a very serious way against immigration. So we see for the very first time in American history the rise of significant immigration restriction laws. They began to really inhibit the movement of Europeans, especially as far as the United States is concerned. They established there's a series of these laws, and each one's based on kind of quotas. And the quotas were clearly designed to inhibit poor people from coming, to inhibit Southern Europeans from coming, to inhibit Eastern Europeans. So the very people I told you about that were the new immigrants, they're the essential targets. And each time they passed a new law, it was even more restrictive, essentially, virtually beginning to cut off immigration, at least as far as the Europeans were concerned. And it's just interesting that means that in the 1920s, the Statue of Liberty, which had been holding that lamp, which the famous poet, "Bring us your humble masses yearning to breathe free." Well, the Statue of Liberty now became a stop sign. You guys aren't welcome anymore. So we do have a significant movement, to inhibit immigration in the 1920s. And the intriguing thing, of course, is not going to stop immigration. It's just going to change the direction of immigration. So instead of people coming to the United States from Europe, increasingly they're going to be coming from south of the border. So it's a different, it's a new world dynamic of immigration that will dominate the 20th century, whereas the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, absolutely dominated by the Atlantic migration. So the immigration restriction is the significant reactionary outcome, of course, of what was happening in the 1920s. I do want you to know that, there had been a relatively open door policy that everyone could come and want. They used to call it the golden doors. It's the golden doors of America that are open for everyone. And we all know that they could not have remained open forever. I definitely believe in immigration. I believe that immigration is generally a positive thing for America, but even I understand that you can't let every single person in. It would overwhelm the United States, of course. And there are many undesirables that we don't want here, of course. The vast majority of the people who do come as immigrants, are hardworking, good people that are coming here that in most ways are actually benefiting the economy of the United and benefiting generally the American situation. But it's almost kind of nice that these reactionaries in the 20s began the process of restriction, of course, so that perhaps more progressive or liberal-minded people wouldn't have had to have done it later. Okay, one of the most pronounced manifestations of reaction in the 1920s was the resurgence in many ways, but it's not exactly right, but the reappearance of the Ku Klux Klan. And the Ku Klux Klan will rise again in the 1920s. And I want you to know it's different. This is a potential identification for the final examination. But, it's clearly distinct from the Klan of the Reconstruction. But, based upon the model of the Ku Klux Klan, the original Ku Klux Klan, the Klan will ride again in the 1920s. So let me tell you the story behind the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, the Klan actually found its point of origin in the year 1915. And what created the foundation for the rise of Ku Klux Klan was a blockbuster movie that came out in 1915. This movie is America's first great blockbuster. It's America's first great movie in terms of just the impact that it will have. It was the first movie to make a tremendous amount of money. It was re-released over 15 years. It made, I can't remember, $50 million, which at that time was an amazing amount of money. But the movie was, and it was produced and directed by one of the great early movie people, David Walker Griffith. It was called The Birth of a Nation, and here's the poster that would have accompanied the movie The Birth of a Nation. The Birth of a Nation is the heroic telling of the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. It came from a book called The Klansman, and in this book, the Klan they're the heroes, they're the good guys, right? Radical Reconstruction people, the freedmen are the bad guys, and the Klan are the good guys. And it kind of shows just the Southern attitude that kind of swept the nation in some ways, that, that although it was good that slavery was gone, the South was a very good place, and the Southern values were very good, of course, and their racial attitudes were entirely appropriate. And so here we're in the 19-teens, we're seeing this resurgence of an interest and support for something like the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, it really was this extraordinarily popular movie. Now, there's so many sides to this movie. On the one hand, it was a cinematographical masterpiece. It was amazing. It's one of the most innovative movies. It was the first great movie, the first great innovation. Super long. I think it went more than 2 hours long. All kinds of technical additions. They started the Irish shot idea, where you kind of go from nothing to the shot opening up and the shot closing. That was one of their innovations. There's a little bit of colorization that was done. It was the first time ever that a panning camera was used. It's so funny, it's like they never realized that you could move the camera. It took them a long time. And I've always wondered, who was the first person to invent the panning of a camera? And I pictured, there's a cameraman, he's doing something, and of course somebody knocks him, Joe runs into him, and the camera jerks. He's like, what the hell, man? You're jerking the camera around. But that just opened his mind. Oh my God, we could take the camera and we could move the camera, So for the first time ever, the camera's actually making moving. It was the first time they used the integrated editing of action scenes. So you would see the chase from the back, you'd see the chase from the front. Integrating that in a powerful kind of way. Authentic costuming that they would use. Authentic attempting to make historical representations of the whole thing. Just an amazingly long list, kind of the first original score. That was the first time a movie had an original score that was made just for that particular movie. Anyway, it was an amazing movie. From the point of view of cinematography, it was amazing. But from the social point of view, it was extraordinarily racist, as you can imagine. I mean, this is just seeped in racism. Its greatest fan was Woodrow Wilson. I told you Wilson was a racist, and he thought it was the greatest movie ever made because it was a movie that was just drenched in racism. The Southern whites, of course, are the heroes. That means everyone else is going to be the bad guys. The proponents of Reconstruction are the bad guys. The carpetbaggers are the bad guys. The freedmen are the bad guys. And that movie, of course, depicts African Americans with every racial stereotype you can possibly imagine. There's a scene where, the African Americans the freedmen are parts of the legislature of this state, and they come in, of course, in a very disrespectful kind of way, and the guy plunks himself down and takes off his shoe, and his big toes kind of wiggling outside, and another guy opens up the desk and takes out a huge turkey bones gnawing on that, and another guy's reaching for a bottle that says XXX, and he's taking a big swig of moonshine during the actual activity. I mean, the whole thing is just sort of drenched in this incredible racism that really dominated the black nadir. And indeed, the villain of the story was a black person. So this is like he's got it all together. He was a northern black carpetbagger who had come down south. And the one thing that is intriguing is that the individual who played this was clearly a white man. And so a white person in black face. And you just look at the guy, the features are all. And that may have been done purposely by Griffith. He didn't want to inspire too much racial animosity, though my guess is a whole bunch of people ran out of that movie and lynched somebody. I mean, they were inspired by this kind of activity. But anyway, just, extraordinary. And by the way, the bad thing is that this villain, he attempts to rape a white woman, and of course he's not successful, but even because he even tried to, he holds her, maybe he kissed on her, she goes and commits suicide. I mean, in those days, any white woman tainted at all by black flesh, of course you had to kind of get rid of that. And the final heroic scene is, of course, the Klansmen running down upon this villain and his cohort, and killing them all in a chase and then a shootout, basically. Anyway, this movie comes out in 1915. They premiered it in Atlanta, Georgia, so they took it to the South to premiere it, and it simply becomes the inspiration behind the movie. So I should put this for you, D.W. Griffith's famous movie, The Birth of a Nation. Now, one of the people who went to the premiere was a man by the name of William Simmons. William Simmons was, I think he perceived himself as kind of an evangelical minister, but I think his profession was an insurance salesman. And he just was so inspired by all of this. On the night of the premiere, he and his buddies dressed up in what they perceived to be the Klan outfits, and they burned a cross, and they had a hell of a good time, of course, And he simply was so inspired by everything, by the movie, that he decided he wanted to get the Klan going again. He said, this is great, let's do it, let's get the Klan going again. So I just want to let you see good old William Simmons here. To be honest with you, I've never seen him before, so this is my first time. What a wonderful guy, no doubt about that, okay. So anyway, this is how I feel about that kind of situation. Anyway, William Simmons decides he wants to get the Klan going if he possibly can. So he starts to try to organize the Klan. Now the problem was that nobody wanted a Klan. I mean, there's no need for a Klan. The Klan was a device of Reconstruction, a way to sabotage Reconstruction. But why would you need that now, like in the 1920s or 1915? You've got yourself lynching if you want to be violent. You've got segregation. You've got disenfranchisement. You've got the black population is controlled. There's nothing they can even do, basically. So to recreate the Klan of Reconstruction doesn't make any sense. And Simmons finds himself frustrated. He's trying to rebuild his Klan, and no one's really going to go along with this. Well, in 1920, he does something very interesting. It's very 20s when you think about it. He hired a public relation firm. So the firm is called Clark and Tyler. I know that their first names are Elizabeth and William. It was a man and a woman, Elizabeth and William. I can never remember if it's William Clark and Elizabeth Tyler or Elizabeth Clark and William Tyler, but it was the firm of Clark and Tyler, a man and woman who ran a PR firm. So Simmons goes to them and he says, can you help me to figure out how to get this Klan thing going? And so Clark and Tyler decided to do basically what we would call market analysis, find out if you could figure out a way to promote the Klan. And so they do their market analysis, and then they come back to Simmons, and they tell him, we think we can make this thing go. But the one thing they told him is, we don't think we can make it happen in the South, but we think we can make it happen in the North, in the Midwest, in the Far West, in the Northeast. He said, we think that there is actually a groundswell of support for this kind of activity. So what happened was the three of them get together and they began to market the Klan. And I want you to understand, it's very 20s. They're basically going to sell the Klan. They're going to sell the memberships of the Klan. So they began to actively promote and market their Klan. They would ultimately sell Klan memberships for $10 a pop, okay, $10 a pop. And I just wanted to tell you how this all is going to work itself out financially. So they sold the memberships for $10 a pop, and of that, $2 would go to Simmons and $2.50 would go to Clark and Tyler. And the critical factor there, it's on this card, of course, is that, you know, by the time we get to 1925, there's about 5 million members of the Ku Klux Klan. So I'm telling you, these guys are going to make some serious money. I mean, they got rich on marketing the Klan. Now, that they would market the Klan, you know, it makes sense. I mean, it's just entrepreneurial activity. They're trying to make money, okay? But the essential question of the moment is not so much why they would try to sell the Klan, and in many ways it kind of was a pyramid scheme. These guys, the more the people they got in, of course, the more that they would generate. I think the more interesting question is, you know, why would people buy the Klan? Why did people buy in to this at this particular kind of moment? I also want you to know that not only did they sell the memberships, and, you know, part of it would go to Clark and Tyler, part to Simmons, part would go to the organization, part would go to the propaganda. Of course, you know, all of this was to build up the situation. They would also sell the outfits. So I showed you Mr. Simmons' really cool outfit there. It cost $8 for your basic white Klan outfit with a pointy hat, and it would be more if you got kind of the colorful thing that he would have, all right? So, the question of the moment for the Klan is, why did people buy into the Klan? You know, because it's, you know, it's not so much that they would try to sell it, that's just rational. They're trying, of course, to make money. Why did the people buy into it? So there's kind of two things that I would like to highlight. You know, what is the foundation for the growth of the Klan? And the first one is that the Klan very effectively spoke to their fears. These were fearful people, and you guys all know the importance of fear kind of in the political situation. It's been intriguing to me how much fear has been a general part of our political environment over the last few years. Our president, I think, seems to think that fear is a powerful generating motivator and is a way to gain a tremendous amount of political support. I get it, it works in many ways. And there are always going to be fearful people in America. I don't know if I told you guys this, but I was reading this article that talked about the fact that the death rate or the life expectancy in America is going down, and so much of that is based upon suicide and opioid overdoses, so drug overdoses, and that the primary individuals who are suffering this are white men who are not without college educations or without BAs, of course, and you know, they're seeing their world is kind of falling apart around them. They can't find jobs. They can't keep up with the economy. And part of the result is kind of this, you know, internal destruction, self-destruction of using drugs and alcohol and maybe suicide. But part of it is also, you know, trying to blame everybody else for this, you know. And, you know, they're fearful of their situation. They're very much attuned to the conspiracy notions and theories that can come out, you know. It's like they want to blame someone else, but they're afraid. There's always going to be people afraid. And, you know, I'm afraid of things. I'm afraid of this damn pandemic, of course, you know. I'm afraid that we're not dealing with the environment. I'm afraid of the political climate of America. I mean, there's always going to be some kind of fears there. And the whole issue is, you know, how do you deal with all of that? Well, there's a lot of fear among at least a proportion of American population. They felt that they were falling behind. They felt the modern America was sort of leaving them behind. They didn't like the transitioning to this new modern culture and things like that. So these are a fearful group, of course, and the Klan was very effective in its propaganda of speaking to their fears and attracting the attention of these people. Another thing the Klan did, and this is just so classic and so ancient, we call it scapegoating, basically. But they targeted the enemy. This is something that is very routine. It's a device used by politicians and others. You know, you find someone to blame everything on. And I think we know that the current president, of course, has done a lot to blame everything on immigrants. The immigrants come off extraordinarily poorly, at least in his estimation. You know, these negative kind of figures, you know, not necessarily based on truth, just based upon, you know, this perception. But this is a way, of course, you know, to gain support in a variety of ways. And the Klan was extremely effective. It's, you know, you're scapegoating. You're putting your problem on someone else. You know, of course, you're blaming them for the situation. And routinely, you know, the people they were blaming, it's not true. They aren't the real problem. The real problem here is modernization, the rise of corporate, you know, all these kind of things that are going on. and yet, you just kind of, you distract them, you diverge them, create another kind of enemies list. And I'm sure you guys can guess who would have been the enemies for the Klan in the 20s. Immigrants, of course. Immigrants are taking over America. They're bringing their foreign influence. It's going to be terrible for America. They blamed Catholics. Most of the Klan were Protestants, white Protestants, and they didn't like the diversity of religious activities in America. Of course, they blamed the Jews. And in many ways, they are very much like the fascists. The fascists are kind of it's an anti-modern expression in Europe. And the fascists were keen, of course, on targeting enemies, making sure, Hitler is the archetype here, of course, blaming the Jews for just about everything, essentially. The Klan would blame women, feminists. They didn't like the flappers. They thought that was really bad. They blamed the modernists, those that would promote modern ideas. They were hostile to organized crime, which of course is not necessarily a wrong attitude in any kind of way, but the Klan was very effective in targeting the enemy, just making sure that the people in the Klan kind of knew, here's the people who are doing us damage, and we're going to present them to you as clearly as you possibly can. So by speaking to their fears and targeting the enemy, they just gained the attraction and attention of a significant number of Americans who were just feeling out of whack in terms of the developments of the 20s. Now I want to tell you kind of, what's going on here. Generally speaking, the Klan was like a huge social club. So a lot of people, 5 million people, a lot of people are joining this club. And most Klan members, I call them fellow travelers, they're just kind of going along with the whole situation. So they would gain a membership, they would get their outfit, they would go to the rallies, they would commiserate with other people of like-minded, they would read the Klan propaganda, and that's pretty much all they're going to do in their activity. But one thing that always happens, especially when you have a organization that's targeting enemies, there will always be a pathological expression to this situation. And clearly the Klan had a pathological expression. So there were some who aren't willing just to be, go along with the kind of social activities. There were some that wanted to go after the enemies. So they're going to use, violence. They're going to use intimidation. They're going to use murder, essentially, to express themselves. So the Klan was not, it's a big social club, but it had a violent side that is important to note. I also want you to know that the Klan became extremely powerful, not just, of course, as a social group, but politically. There are 5 million voters that were part of the Ku Klux Klan. They will elect a lot of Klan members to the governing apparatus, including governors and members of the House of Representatives and the Senate. And so they're going to be able to do that. They expressed their political power by, it's kind of the peak of their moment was 1925, by holding a massive parade in Washington, D.C. In 1925, the Klan marched down Pennsylvania Avenue. Pennsylvania Avenue is the nation's parade route between the Capitol and the White House. And the Klan marched down that road, 250,000 strong. I mean, it was a fairly impressive thing to see all these Klan people in their Klan outfits and Klan mothers, pushing Klan babies in Klan strollers, proudly displaying their situation as far as the United States is concerned. So, the Klan kind of has a political expression, and it's just quite impressive, at least in the 1920s, showing how many people were feeling disconcerted and unhappy with the developments of the 1920s. In the end, the Klan has kind of a meteoric rise, so it starts in 20 and it kind of just really jumps up until 1925, gaining membership, of course, and increasing the relative wealth of especially Simmons and Clark and Tyler. But then it began to kind of fall. It begins to, not exactly collapse, but begin to descend in the aftermath and later part of the 1920s. And what happened to it was kind of, the inherent cynicism of it. It was kind of a pyramid scheme. It was basically designed to enrich these people, more than it was, a true social movement in any kind of way. So the essential cynicism became increasingly just known to even those that were part of it. And then finally, like so many organizations like this, where there is a tremendous amount of money being generated, it began to be racked by scandal. Individual Klansmen were doing bad things that began to be increasingly known. Sort of the classic scandal that became known in the Klan was this event that occurred. I guess the Grand Dragon of Indiana was running for governor, and he was campaigning across the state. And a young woman had volunteered to be part of his campaign staff. And the two of them, they're all traveling across the state on a train one day when this Grand Dragon starts to come on to this young woman, and she resists him. She didn't want to interact, and he finally raped her. She's raped by this guy, and it's that kind of double agony of rape. You're being raped, and that's horrible, but you're being raped by someone you respect, and that kind of really compounds the damage essentially. And this woman, just devastated by this, she goes home and she decides to drink mercury. Mercury is a dread poison, I'm sure you guys know, but it's like the worst way to kill yourself. It slowly eats away at your internal organs, and I think it took her like 30 days to die. And she's home, and she's getting sicker and sicker, and her parents are distraught, and they're bringing doctors in to see what's going on, And only when she's in the final stages does she tell the tale, that she had been raped and that she drank mercury, and of course, she died after that. And this became, of course, a story that became part of the press. In the United States, the press began to, Grand Dragon of Indiana accused of raping this woman, etc., and she commits suicide. You can imagine this kind of story. So this and other scandals began to rack the Klan, and the Klan began to fade, at least to some degree, heading into the 1930s. It never does really disappear. It's there in the 1930s, kind of holding on, just struggling through the 40s, and then reinvigorated in the 1950s, of course, this time in the South, and this time in response to the civil rights activities. So the Klan becomes a major expression of the reactionary side of the 1920s, probably the closest thing we had really to kind of American fascism developing in the United States at that time. The final manifestation of reaction that I want to highlight for you for the 1920s was this sensational trial that occurred in 1925. I made a mistake there, darn it. 1925. And this is called the Scopes trial. And the Scopes trial will be an identification for the final exam, the Scopes trial. Scopes trial is a very interesting kind of event that occurred in the 1920s, sort of captured the attention of the nation and to some degree even the rest of the world, and really is a symbol of the division of the United States, the battle that was taking place, the cultural civil war between the forces of modern and the forces of the older culture in America. Now, the story is cynical in the ways that so many things are kind of in the 20s. So it involves a little town in Tennessee called Dayton, Tennessee. And Dayton, Tennessee wasn't doing too well in the 20s. It's part of the agricultural depression I'll tell you about a little bit later, but old cotton producing area just kind of hanging in there. And one day, the town fathers are all sitting around in a barber shop, and they're commiserating with each other how bad the economy is, how much this town is struggling, and trying to kind of figure out, is there any way that they could reinvigorate their town? And so the whole thing is really about, let's try to get this town and let's try to build it up if we possibly can. Now, one of the guys that's sitting there that day, he knew that there was a new law that the state of Tennessee had passed. And this law, this Tennessee law, was a law that prohibited the teaching of anything that opposed creationism. So basically the law made it against the law in Tennessee to teach evolution. And he knew that that was a new law. He knew that there was some potential controversy there. And he simply thought, what if we make this into a case in our town, okay? And so what really is going on here, the Scopes trial is a publicity stunt. It's a publicity stunt on the part of this little town to attract attention to the town. And I got to tell you, if you look at it from that point of view, tremendously successful. I mean, it did bring a whole bunch of people to Dayton. It did stimulate the economy. And even today, you can go to Dayton, Tennessee, and it's still part of like a tourist attraction. You can do the Scopes trial trail. You can buy souvenirs and all that kind of stuff of the monkey trial or whatever they wanted to call it that time. But anyway, so this is really just a little town, it's deciding to try to help itself out if it can by challenging this law. So what they had to do was figure out some way to make it a case. And so they were thinking, okay, we have to have a teacher that will say that they taught evolution, because you have to violate the law to make it any kind of a legal issue. So one of them in this barbershop knew of this young man by the name of John Scopes. John Scopes was 24 years old. He was an old high school football hero. He'd gone away to college, and he was back in the town being, I think he was the JV coach for the high school, and he was teaching science at the middle school, at the junior high school. And he was young, he was unattached, of course, and a critical part was that they thought he might be willing. So they called up John Scopes, and they basically said to John, will you take one for the team? Are you willing to take one for the team? And of course, John, he's team player, what can I say? Sure, what do you need me to do? And I've always wondered, if he knew what was going to happen, would he still have volunteered so readily? But he volunteers to be kind of the pawn in this larger game, and his name becomes famous all across the world. So intriguing kind of outcome here. One thing that we don't know, and we're pretty sure, is true. We don't think he taught evolution. We don't think, there's no evidence that he necessarily even taught evolution in his class, but he simply was willing to say that he taught evolution, and so it kind of shows you that it's all it's a stunt and more than anything else. The most that they really knew was that there was at least a paragraph in the textbook that he used that had something to do with evolution. So that became at least part of the evidence that was presented. Well, so in the summer of 1925, this small little town has this legal case that just explodes, and the entire world, of course, is going to pay attention to the whole thing. It was the summer of 1925. It's going to be super hot. When you ever see pictures from the trial, you see everyone wearing seersucker suits that they, of course, are stripping down as much as they can, rolling their sleeves up. Everyone's got a fan trying to, super hot. On the hottest day, and when it got really crowded, they took the whole courtroom and put it outside on the lawn under the trees. That's the kind of climactic situation that was going to happen here. Now, the case attracted really high-powered legal attention. So for the prosecution, and the prosecution was done primarily by the county prosecutor, and the county prosecutor was a very effective prosecutor, so he was in charge of the whole thing. But supporting the prosecution was a man by the name of William Jennings Bryan. Now, I've never told you about William Jennings Bryan, but he was extraordinarily famous at that time. He was a 3-time Democratic candidate for president. And you guys know that anyone who's even running for president has to be fairly well known, and he did it 3 times. I'm sure you guys know that means he's a 3-time loser. He was a Democratic politician who tried to run for the president on 3 different occasions. He was a senator from the state of Nebraska. He was an avid a fundamentalist Christian, an avid creationist, and what no one knew was that he was really at the very end of his life. He died 5 days after the trial was over. So this guy is in the final major activity of his life. But in his final years of his life, he simply became a crusader to support creationism, of course, and to get rid of this godless evolution, which he saw, of course, as a tremendous anathema. So although he doesn't really do that much, he's going to be there, and he's going to be a critical part of the drama as it works itself out. So for the prosecution, very famous, nationally known William Jennings Bryan. For the defense came a man by the name of Clarence Darrow. And Clarence Darrow, and he actually is kind of employed by the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Unit, and willing to step in to defend John Scopes and, of course, to defend teaching of evolution. Darrow is one of the most famous trial lawyers in America, and just an amazing individual who could really work. I mean, this is the guy that he's kind of the model for all the people we ever see on TV that are supposed to be these really wonderful lawyers. He could have probably been the richest lawyer in the world, of course, if he'd taken the corporate kind of road, but he always took the difficult case, the social case, the unpopular case. He defended these 2 rich boys who'd gone out on a spree and just killed this kid for fun. And the reason he did that was because he didn't believe in the death penalty. They were guilty, and everyone knew it, but he didn't want them to, be put to death for it. And he got them off. They were given life imprisonment. He defended these kind of anarchist individuals who bombed the LA Times in Los Angeles, and they really did him wrong. They perjured themselves. They lied, and they lied to him too. And he ultimately would be declared in contempt of court, gets thrown in jail for it. He was willing to take these really kind of uncomfortable and difficult cases, but he will step forward, of course, to defend John Scopes and, of course, evolution. He described himself as an agnostic. So I don't know if you guys know the situation. A theist would be someone who believes in God. An atheist, so A means no. Atheist means no God. And the only thing I always think to myself is that that's a faith. Okay, it's a faith that there is a God, but it's also going to be a faith that there isn't a God. There's as much evidence that there is God as there is not God. Now, an agnostic, gnosos is the Greek word for knowledge. So agnostic means, I don't know. I just don't know what's going on here. He doesn't know if there's God or not. But he was a supporter of modern science. He was a supporter of evolution. And he came, of course, prepared to defend John Scopes and to defend evolution as best he possibly could. So high-powered legal attention on both sides. As the trial started, it's like the nation came to hear it. There was press from everywhere, and every day after the trial, they'd run out and they'd do their they'd be typing on their typewriters and get their story on the phone and all this kind of stuff. The radio was there too. WGN was beginning to develop a following out of Chicago, and they essentially broadcast the entire trial to the nation. So it's one of the first times ever a kind of media spectacle that surrounded the trial. Of course, it attracted crazies like you can't believe it, of course, those that were supportive, those that were against evolution. There were guys that would bring monkeys down and dress them up like human beings, of course, and gorillas. And they came up with their cute little songs like, "You can't make a monkey out of me. No, you can't make a monkey out of me." And another one I don't know the music. Lots of monkey business down in Tennessee. For some reason, I'm using, I think, a Christmas song to back that one up. Anyway, so it was a circus, and it was exactly what the town fathers wanted. They wanted all these people and all this attention to come to Dayton, and of course, it was working out perfectly. Now, the trial was, as you can imagine, dramatic and kind of crazy in its own way. On the first day, the judge made a ruling, and he said there can be no discussion of evolution in the trial. So Darrow had lined up a bunch of scientists and professors who were going to present the evidence of evolution, And by the way, it wasn't quite as thick as it is now, but still substantial at that time. And the judge basically threw his case out of the court, But Darrow was smart. He was quick on his feet, and so he figured in a moment, well, if it's not going to be a trial on evolution, it's got to become a trial on creationism. And of course, a very problematic, provocative, and dangerous kind of way to proceed. He was in the middle of the Bible Belt, where you have all these God-fearing Protestant Christians down there in the South, of course. And I got to tell you, when he began to move in this direction, there were death threats on his life every single day. I mean, everyone saw him basically as in line with the devil. So the trial became, the discussion was more on creationism than it was on evolution. Well, it was only on creationism. And the dramatic moment was when Darrow stood up in front of the courthouse and he said, so who will stand for the Bible? Who will be our chief, our witness, essentially, that will present the evidence for creationism? And amazingly, William Jennings Bryan raises his hand because he was a devout Christian. He was a fundamentalist. He knew his Bible up and down, basically. So he was willing to step forward, of course, to be the individual who would defend creationism. And he took the stand, of course, and how interesting is that to have the defense attorney cross-examine, of course, or just examine the prosecuting attorney. And Darrow kind of, put him through the ringer. What he made, it's fine if you're a fundamentalist. It's fine if you believe in creationism, but you have to understand that that's an article of faith so much more than an article of fact. I mean, the entire story of creation is one page of the Bible. There's not a lot of evidence there necessarily. And so Darrow began to challenge him on a variety of different things, all through the kind of the whole part of Genesis. And parts I remember, of course, so Eve came from a bone from Adam, how would that happen? And so Jonah was swallowed by a whale. So what kind of whale is that? Is that a baleen? These kind of things that just are very difficult to explain. The kind of killer question, though, in the Bible, it says God made the sun stand still. I can't remember what the moment is, but God makes the sun stand still. And even, the most ignorant, unscientific American knew essentially, in terms of the nature of the solar system, there is no way in the world that God can make the sun stand still. And so in the end of that day, Darrow pretty much succeeded in making Bryan look kind of foolish about the whole thing. And he ultimately would feel very badly about that, especially in the aftermath. Bryan would die relatively quickly. But at the end of that day, as Darrow was leaving the courthouse, he got a standing ovation from the entire the press corps. They were all very much supportive, of course, of his modern scientific evolution-oriented view. Now, the trial was really, just a farce in some ways. The law said you couldn't teach evolution, and John Scope said he had taught it, and I'm running out of battery real quick. Anyway, he was found guilty, and he would be fined $100. That became this fine, which was later reversed on a technicality. And all this really does, of course, is it shows us the battle between the forces of modernization, the forces, of course, of reaction, and the fact that although the reactionary won the battle, it seems like the modernists are winning the war in the 1920s, and it looks like I better shut it down.